Hi everybody, and welcome to this video all about the basic principles of photography. In this video we're going to talk about how the photographer can control the amount of light which reaches the film or the sensor, and how to get really good photographs. So here are the three basic principles of photography. You need to know about exposure and how to control that thing. You need to know about focus, how to control that, and you need to know about composition and how to control that as well. So although photography has changed a lot in recent years as digital photography takes over, the basics of photography haven't changed at all, and that is that if your photograph is correctly exposed, it's in focus and is well composed, it stands a very good chance of being a good photo. But if any of these things is wrong, the image will be ruined. I'll show you what I mean. Here's a character that some of you will be familiar with, and this is a correctly exposed image. It wasn't taken on the sunniest day or anything like that, but it's correctly exposed. And the reason it's correctly exposed is because it's got some areas which are very, very light. Like, for example, the lightest bit of this image is probably Mumu's shoulder here. And it's got very, very black blacks. For example, over here, away from the light, on Mumu's right arm there is very, very black. And it's got everything in between. That's the definition of a well-exposed photograph. Compare that to these two. The one on the left is overexposed. Now it's got too much what they call highlights. There's too much white in this image. It's overexposed. It's too white. Basically, there are too many white parts. There aren't any really black parts to this image. The blackest part again is probably the character's right arm here, but it's probably more like dark grey now than black. And that's the definition of an overexposed photo, where you've got too many highlights and not enough. The black portions of a photograph are called the shadows. The shadows aren't really, really black, and there's too many highlights, too much white and not enough black. By contrast with that, here's an underexposed photograph where there's no whites at all, really. And too many blacks, too many shadows, and not enough highlights. In fact, if you were able to measure the light bits of this photograph, you'd actually find they weren't white at all. They were just very light grey, and that's overexposed. So, as well as being able to tell that something is overexposed or underexposed, there are technical definitions to that as well, to do with the highlights and the shadows. So, the first thing the photographer's got to get right, and probably the most important thing, is exposure, and that's all about letting the right amount of light through the lens onto the photosensitive part of the camera at the back. In the old days that used to be film. These days it's some sort of sensor. Exposure is vital, and it's completely controllable by the photographer. It's up to the photographer really to get exactly the right amount of light to hit the film or the sensor to get the exposure right. And at any given moment, the amount of available light is a measurable commodity. You can measure it, and then you can work out what is the correct exposure. And the photographer's got three main ways of controlling the exposure, controlling how much light gets to the sensor at the back of the camera. And you've seen a little bit of these before when we talked about parts of a camera. And the way that the photographer controls exposure is via the shutter speed, the aperture, which we've talked about already, and also something called the ISO, which is film speed, which we'll talk about a bit later on. But that tends to be set quite early on in the photographic photo shoot or whatever. And from that moment on, it's the shutter speed and the aperture that the photographer can control. And here we can see that shutter speed and aperture affect exposure by controlling the amount of light falling on the film or the sensor. And film speed is just a measure of how sensitive the film or the sensor is, so that makes a difference as well. Now, the first of those you've got to get used to is shutter speed, and that's if you remember, that's how long, that's measured in time, that's how long the shutter is open for. And the photographer has got complete control over this in manual mode. The camera takes it over in auto mode, and it's measured in time. It could be something very, very short, like, see that number here? Just take a few moments to see what that says. It says 1/8,000th of a second. So imagine a second split into 8,000 bits. It's one of those bits. That's if you've got a lot of light available, so you don't need the shutter to be open for very long before the right amount of light falls on the sensor there. So it's if it's a very bright day, for example, you may need very short shutter speeds, like 1/8000th of a second. If it's very dark at night, for example, you want to take a shot of a city at night or something like that, then, I mean, 8 hours is fairly rare, but it's not impossible. And exposures of sort of 1 second, 2 seconds are quite common when there's very low light. If there's lots of light, the likelihood is you'll choose a very short shutter speed like that. 8,000th or 100th of a second is very common. 200th, those sort of things. So shutter speed is controllable by the photographer, and it's the length of time the shutter is open to let light onto the sensor. The thing you need to be careful of, though, is about camera shake. And if you've got a shutter speed of anything shorter than, so less than a 60th of a second, then you might end up with pictures like this. And what that allows is for the camera to move slightly while the shutter is actually open. And that's when you get something called camera shakes there. So you have to be careful of that if you've got short-ish shutter speeds. Sorry, long-ish. If the light is low, you might choose something like a 60th, and anything longer than that, so a second or 2 seconds, and you could get camera shake. But camera shake can be used artistically as well. For example, in this picture, the camera has moved during the exposure, and it's actually created quite an artistic effect there. Now, the other main way that the photographers can control the amount of light falling on the film is the aperture. If you remember, this is a bit like the iris of your eye. So this is about the size of the hole at the front of the camera to let light in. And along with shutter speed, this is the main way that the photographer's got of controlling how much light falls on the film. And it's measured in stops, and it's measured in a slightly strange way in what they call F numbers. You'll hear things like F1, F2, F4 and things like that, and in between ones as well, like F1.4. So you have a look at this list here. And here's the other weird thing about F numbers, about aperture, is that F1 is actually a larger hole than F32. People at this point want to know exactly why those numbers occur. I'm not going to go into that in this video, but if you want to ask me about that or do some Googling about that, then you can find that out. But it's beyond the purposes of this video here. And this is what actually looks like the aperture viewed from the front of the camera. Like the iris of your eye, exactly like that. It closes down to make a bigger hole, like the picture on the left, or a much smaller hole, like the one on the right there, and anything in between. And you see they have names like f2.8, which lets more light in, over to f11, which allows less light in. So you can see how it's weird. The smaller the number, the bigger the hole, the more light comes in. It's just something you have to get used to as a photographer, really. So, of course, you've got the combination of those two things, aperture and shutter speed, to control the light that falls onto the sensor. It's the photographer's job to control those. He or she will be helped by the camera's light meter, though, and the camera, especially modern cameras, will actually suggest a shutter speed and an aperture, a combination of those two, which is just right. For example, a very common combination is 1/500th of a second and an aperture of f4. That's a very common, a very likely combination of a shutter speed and an aperture that you'd get on a normal day in Britain outside, really. 1/500th of a second shutter speed and an aperture of f4. So they're both middling sort of measurements for those two things. But here's the thing, though. That's only one combination that would work. There may be several as well. And the reason for that is that if you double the shutter speed, but you halve the size of the aperture, it actually lets exactly the same amount of film in to reach the film or the sensor. If you double the shutter speed, but halve the size of the aperture, so you make the shutter let light in for twice as long, but you make the aperture half the size, it actually lets the same amount of light in. So in reality, there's actually a series of combinations of shutter speed and aperture that would work for that amount of light. There you see the combination we started with there, third one down, 500ths of a second f4. But all these other combinations would work as well, because they all involve halving the shutter speed and doubling the amount of light let in by the aperture as well. So just spend a bit of time just getting your head around that table before we move on, because there's always actually a combination of shutter speeds and apertures that you can use at any given time, and all of these combinations will let the same amount of light onto the sensor. Which one you would choose, or which one the camera would choose, does depend on things like, say you were doing sport, you'd want a very fast shutter speed to capture the movement of the people playing the sport, so you'd go for the top one there. But if you wanted other type effects, like to change the depth of field and so on, you might choose one from the lower part of this table here. So aperture and shutter speed are the main ways that the photographer has of controlling the amount of light that falls onto the sensor. The other is film speed, and this is a measure of how sensitive the sensor is, or the film is. In the old days, you'd buy your film at a certain speed, and you'd have to stick with it until you change the film. But these days, you can actually change the film speed, or the ISO, as it's called. With digital cameras, you can change it for every picture if you want to get certain effects. And the most common film speeds are 100 and 400 ISO. And you generally always use the slowest film speed you could get away with, because it gives you better quality and less what they call grain. You'd only use higher film speeds, like for example 800, when you really had to. For example, if you didn't have very much light, and by using a slower film, you just couldn't get the exposure right. But if you use slow film speeds, you can end up with something called grain, which is, it looks like it's not the pixels of the picture. It's actually a grainy sort of structure to the picture, which again can be quite artistic, but it's generally considered to be low quality if you do that. But the next thing that you need to get right as a photographer to get your picture right is focus. So here's our friend again, Mumu, out of focus there. That's different from camera shake, notice. This is not camera shake. The camera has stayed perfectly steady during this picture, but it's focused on the wrong thing. The camera's done it automatically, or the photographer's got the focus wrong, and it's actually focused on the background and not the foreground here, and that'll ruin your pictures unless you're going for a particular effect. So you've got to get focus right. Make sure the main subject in your photograph is in focus. And composition is the final thing that, if you get it right, along with exposure and focus, if you get your composition right, you've got a good chance of it being a good photo. By the time you watch this video, you should have done the pairs task and the group task about composition. So this is really just a summary. You should have investigated the rule of thirds, which is the idea that you split the photograph into 9 boxes like this by splitting it into thirds from top to bottom and left to right. And if you put the subject on one of the points where those lines intersect, like the tree here in this picture, it tends to work well, or the face of the wolf here, or the bee's eye there. And you might be thinking, after all of this, why do we need to worry about any of this? Exposure, focus, and composition? Because the camera can take care of the exposure and the focus, but it can't take care of the composition, for one thing, so you do need to learn about that. And also, cameras don't always get it right. For example, snow scenes can really fool cameras, because they expect because there's so much light coming in, they tend to underexpose them and try and get everything equally sort of white and equally grey. So that can really fool automatic cameras. And also, most cameras have autofocus, but sometimes they can just get it wrong like that, and you'd have to put the camera in manual there and get that right yourself. Or similarly like this. Although again, that's quite an artistic shot there. That might be what you're looking for, but it might not be. So it's up to the photographer to get that right. So going back to the beginning again here, the basic principles of photography is if you get your exposure right, your focus right, your composition right, you've got a good chance of getting a good photo. So the homework is to work out how to change the shutter speed and aperture and focus and film speed on your own particular digital camera, then take some shots at various shutter speeds and apertures to show the range that your camera has, and just play around with these ideas. Okay, so thanks for watching this video all about the basic principles of photography. There's just a reminder again about, if you understand exposure and focus and composition, you're well on the way to taking some really good photos. So go and try that out, and I'll see you on the next video.